In this training module, I want to talk with you about how to build your experience section on your LinkedIn profile. The experience section is the meat and potatoes of your LinkedIn profile. This is where you're going to have some of your most important content. And of course, it's going to be either similar to your resume or perhaps even identical to what's on your resume. Let's start by talking a little bit about the strategy of what content to include in your experience section. First of all, it can include work experience, obviously. It can also include volunteer experience. It's not titled work experience, it's titled experience. So I would include any experience you have that adds credibility to the type of roles that you're targeting, and particularly that fills in a gap that you might have in your experience history. So for example, if you were out of work for some period of time and you completed a certificate or other coursework, rather than having a gap in your experience section, I would actually add that educational experience here. If you were out of work for a while and did some volunteering and the volunteering experience was relevant, even if it perhaps wasn't relevant, I would still add it here because we don't want to have a gap in our experience if at all possible. Another thing to think about is what work experiences do you want to include in your experience section? The key is to be selective. Most people include 10 to 15 years of experience on their resume, and it should be about the same on your LinkedIn profile. I'm an older guy, and I'm not listing what I did, 40 years ago when I graduated from college. First of all, it probably isn't relevant to what we're targeting today. And second, even if it was relevant, someone would say, Jeff, that was 40 years ago, right? What have you done recently that's useful and valuable to me? And of course, we don't want to age ourselves. So depending on how long you've been working, I would be selective about how far back you go in your experience. Generally, 10 to 15 years is a good guide. Another consideration is that you probably want to have the same work experience on your resume and your LinkedIn profile. I've seen some situations where it might make sense to have some experience on our LinkedIn profile that's not on a particular resume targeted to a specific type of role, but I'd be really careful about that. We want to have the same story being told on our resume or resumes and our LinkedIn profile. If you do have some older experience that you do want to include on your LinkedIn profile, I'm talking about, more than 15 years old, I would only include the really core information in that experience that is relevant to the types of roles that you're targeting. The reason that you're including on your profile, I wouldn't add a lot of content for older roles. So let's talk about the content that goes into an experience section. As an example, we can look at my experience section here. You can see that I've been working for myself for quite a long time. So I've got a lot of content in here because this is what I'm doing is very relevant to what I'm targeting. I had one work experience that overlapped. I worked for the 5 O'Clock Club when I was setting up my career coaching business. So it was a while ago, but it's relevant. So I've included it here. You can see I've included less content. And when I first launched my coaching business, I also worked for another company for a short period of time. Again, included the experience because it's relevant and just a little bit about it. And then the way I handled my previous experiences, chief operating officer for a variety of businesses. And I feel like it gives me credibility on my profile because I was in the business world too. And I've hired many people and managed them, coached them. So it's a relevant skill set. So again, I've included it here, but it's an older experience. I have included a lot of content. And you'll see I have opted to go back further on my LinkedIn profile. And I go back to the early part of my career because it is relevant. In this case, you can see I've said I held a variety of roles from 92 to 99 that were largely wrong for me. And I landed those roles largely because I had connections and that when someone interviewed me, they could see that I was motivated to get the job done. So while I did well in the jobs, they just weren't the right things for me. Why did I include that on my profile? Because I work with a lot of clients who aren't satisfied in their careers. They landed in a place or have found themselves in a place that just isn't the right fit. So I include this information because it's relevant, right? It tells potential clients, I get you, right? I've been there. I know the pain and the frustration of waking up not wanting to go to work. Let's take a look at the content that I've included in my most recent work experience and what it says and the structure of it, because you want to use this model for the content that you're going to include in your work experience going back the last 10 to 15 years on your LinkedIn profile. The first piece of content communicates what's the big value that I deliver in my job that's relevant to the type of role that I'm targeting. Founder and career coach of a leading career coaching company in New York City that helps people to identify new career paths and make their transitions. That's the value that I have to offer. And then in my second paragraph, I'm going to talk about the skills that I have, the skills that I use to accomplish that. Skills and strengths assessment, career option assessment, resumes, LinkedIn cover letters, job search, network interviewing. Now, you may recall that those were the skills that we saw in the job advertisement that we looked at in our previous training module. And I want to include those skills in my work experience because you may recall from another training module in this LinkedIn program that LinkedIn's algorithm is looking for the keywords that recruiters are searching for in your work experience. So I've included those skills that I said, perhaps in my headline at the top of my profile, that I've included in the about section of my LinkedIn profile. And now I'm repeating those skills again in my work experience because I want LinkedIn's algorithm to give me credit for using these skills. I'll score more points in LinkedIn's algorithm. I'm going to show up higher in the search results of recruiters and, in my case, clients who are looking for services. After revealing the skills that I use in this job, then my next two paragraphs are about my brand. What is it about me that's unique, different than a lot of other people who might be applying for this type of job, that it would be interesting to a potential employer? Depending on your background, your amount of work experience, the type of role you're targeting, you may or may not have this kind of branding content. But I would think about, what makes you you? What's the value that you have to bring? So part of my value is I've worked with a wide range of clients, from students in school to recent graduates to senior executives and virtually everything in between. And because I've been doing this for so long, I really have an encyclopedic knowledge of different jobs and career ideas. So that's my brand, and I'm talking about that here. Underneath that, I'm going to talk about, here's the proof that I deliver value. Here's my accomplishments. And much like we talked about earlier when we talked about the About section for your LinkedIn profile, if you can quantify your accomplishments, do it here. But if you can't quantify them, either because they're not quantifiable or you don't have those numbers, or you do have the numbers and it's proprietary and you just can't share them, then share your accomplishments in a more general way. And again, unique to my situation, I've included my contact information. You obviously want to do that if you're working for a company and looking for another job. That's the type of content, that's the structure that goes into your more recent work experience. Now let's take a look at some of my older experiences. For my experience at the 5 o'clock club, it's not that terribly old, right? 7 to 10 years. I could have included more content here. And if I had worked for a bunch of different employers over the last 7 to 10 years, I probably would have included more content here. But I own my own business today, so I'm really focusing on, what it is I've been doing since 2004 when I set this up. So you can see this is an overlapping work experience. And I talk about my big value proposition, career coach, national outplacement firm that helps people with resume, job search, networking, interviewing. So what do? I get my key skills into another job. For my experience prior to that, I was a consultant and coach. And again, because it's relevant, I've included it and just a little bit of content. And you can see I repeated some of the keywords again: career clarity, resume, job search, interview, coaching. And then we talked about my previous work experience a little bit earlier in this video and why I chose to include them here. Another thing I want to talk about is how to handle it if you're currently unemployed in your work experience. It's important to understand that when recruiters search on LinkedIn, they're often looking at our most current experience. And if we're unemployed, our current experience may show up in their screen as unemployed. So I recommend, if you're unemployed, is create another experience as if you actually do have a job now. And then I'd be creative and honest about that experience. For example, if I was studying, perhaps in a certificate program, or perhaps on my own, self-study, I would indicate that here. In my title, for example, I could put career coaching student. And instead of putting a workplace, I could put CTI, Coaches Training Institute, which is where I took my training, right? But if I was currently doing that training. And then in my experience section, I would be talking about, in training to become a career coach so I can help people identify good career options and make their transition so they can have the best job of their life. And I would talk about what it is that I'm learning in that self-learning or in that certificate. But I'd say focusing on resume development, job search, and interviewing. If you were a student who graduated a couple months ago and aren't working, you could put the type of role that you're targeting as your employer, put in the name of the school you went to, and in your experience, talk about, what it is that you learned in that school that's relevant to the type of roles that you're targeting to build your credibility. So when a recruiter is searching for candidates online and that search is specifically only looking at your most recent work experience, which sometimes they do, then your profile is going to come up with relevant content. Let's take a look at how you actually enter this information into work experience. You'll click on the pencil. At the top, this is where you'll enter that title. You can see I've got my keywords in there again: career coach, career counselor, interview coach. So be strategic about the title and the keywords that you're putting in your title. I'd also be mindful of the titles that LinkedIn suggests itself. For example, if I type in career, you can see it's suggesting career specialist, career consultant, career coach, career counselor, career services specialist. These titles are likely the terms that recruiters are going to be searching on because LinkedIn is recommending to recruiters, hey, these are the typical titles that people use for this type of role, so why don't you search on those? Therefore, you should use those titles on your profile. So you might say, but Jeff, that's actually not my title at work. That's okay. On a job application where it says list every job you've ever had and list the exact title, you need to list the exact title because you're signing it's absolutely true. On your LinkedIn profile, you can massage your title. You can translate it so it's understandable and relevant. Can't completely change your title to something that has no relevancy to what you're currently working on or studying. But I would use LinkedIn's title recommendations as a really good guide to the titles that you should use in your profile. You can indicate the type of employment, full-time, part-time, self-employed. This is really important, particularly for people who've had shorter term experiences that were contract, freelance, consultant. You can indicate those in the employment type. It helps potential employers to see that they were intended to be short-term roles. Another thing you can do, particularly if you've worked in places for shorter periods of time, is just indicate the year that you started and the year that you ended. For example, if I started a job in December of 2019 and I left in March of 2020, what I can do is rather than showing that I was only there for 3 or 4 months, I would put my start date 2019 and then in my end date 2020. So you don't need to indicate the month. We've already talked about the content that goes into your experience section. It just gets pasted in here. And I just re-emphasize again to put white space, put a row of white space. By a row of white space, I'm talking about a hard return like this between each of the entries. It makes it a lot easier for a reader to skim the content. One last thing to talk about here, if you watch the settings training module in this LinkedIn Breakthrough program, you may recall that there was a setting that you could click on or off about sharing new content or changes that you made on your profile. In this case, I have it set off, but if I wanted my connections to be updated about changes I've made on my profile, I can simply turn it on here. Click Save, and you've completed your work experience. I'll see you in the next training module.